Hi, thanks to those who are joining us. We're just going to wait a minute or two for more people to join, and then we'll commence the seminar. Okay, we might get going now. Thanks for joining us. My name is Sangeetha Chandrasekharan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which this event is being hosted, the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people. I want to pay my respects to elders and families. This land has had a unique role in the life of Aboriginal people, and Aboriginal people have been important custodians and stewards of this land. It is land that has never been ceded. Today's talk is on the prevention of bushfires, or wildfires as they're referred to more commonly outside of Australia. Fire has been a critical part of cultural practice, land care and management by Indigenous custodians for millennia. However, today in the context of colonisation, climate change, urban growth and ecological degradation, bushfires are often a catastrophic and traumatic event, and we need no more evidence of that than the recent spring-summer fires in Australia. In response to those tragic events, we now have a Royal Commission whose final report is due in August, and we also have a Victorian inquiry into the bushfire season. Both of these inquiries do not focus on the important stage of prevention. So today we're trying to lift up this issue, and we do this with the help of three highly regarded researchers and practitioners. Professor Janet Stanley has been working on bushfires for many decades now. She ran the first national interdisciplinary research conference on the prevention of bushfires. She's a principal research fellow at the Sustainable Society Institute. Alan March is professor in urban planning at the School of Design. He's worked on ways that planning and design can modify disaster risks. He researches urban design principles for bushfires. Janet and Alan have been working together for some time. They have an ARC linkage grant. They're also involved in the CRC for bushfires and natural hazards. And they're two of the key authors on a recently published book titled Feeling the Heat: International Perspectives on the Prevention of Wildfire Ignition. And this book is published by Vernon Press. So Janet will speak first, and then Alan. They will both speak for about 15 minutes. After this, Roz Hansen will respond to their presentations. Roz is a Life Fellow of the Planning Institute of Australia. She's also a professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne. She was a member of the Ministerial Advisory Committee for Plan Melbourne, and she's currently chair of the Geelong Authority. In responding to the presentations, Roz will speak for about 10 minutes. We will then have about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. So I would ask you to enter any questions or comments that you have in the Q&A bar, and you can do it as the speakers are presenting. And I will put these questions to the speakers at the end of the presentations. And if there's time, we may open this up for discussion where you can put your hand up and actually ask a question verbally. So without further ado, I would like to ask Janet Stanley to open with her presentation. Thanks, Janet.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this seminar and hearing what we've got to say about bushfires. I've started with a picture of the book. One of the reasons we're holding this seminar is to celebrate or launch, if you like, this book called Feeling the Heat. A second reason I want to talk about today is, I guess it's to open the subject or try and open the subject more generally about prevention of bushfires. It's a very overlooked area. It's one where people assume that fires are going to happen, and in fact, this is not necessarily so. There's many things that can be done to prevent the fires occurring. So I'm going to start by a couple of overviews to set the scene about bushfires and just a few facts around it. There's something like up to 60,000 bushfires regularly recorded annually in Australia, but in fact, there's actually about 5 times as many that occur. But they're not actually recorded or notified. It might be because they're very small, or it might be because there's a cool burn. But satellite video shows that it's actually quite very common. But if we look down under that map of Australia, which actually shows the bushfires, looks as if all Australia's on fire, doesn't it, that occurred in these 5 months recently. There are actually 960,000 odd fires. So it was a very much a unique and different position. So not only are these occurring, but they're increasing, and it's been noted the regular increase of fires. And they're so bad now that we've got a category called catastrophic fires, which is sort of above the previous categories that we had. Interestingly, we don't count greenhouse gas emissions from our emissions total in Australia, but they're almost as much as the total emissions from elsewhere in Australia. So I'm often asked, and it is something that is very hard to understand, why on earth do bushfires get lit? And this is a very old diagram. It's from the Australian Institute of Criminology, but unfortunately their funding has been cut, so they can't do the work on bushfires now. So just to alert you to this, there's about 42% of fires that are recorded are actually, the cause is unknown. And if you look also at the accidental, suspicious and deliberate, there's a lot of unknown around suspicious fires too. Natural is down the bottom in green, and about 4% of fires at this point were caused by lightning. But if you actually take that rate of unknowns, it suggests that about 85% of fires, at least, are actually lit in one way by humans. So one of the issues that particularly came out during the last severe bushfires was this real confusion between arson and climate change as a cause for fires. But just to sort of try and sort this out a bit, fires are mainly lit some way, directly or indirectly, by humans. But because we've failed to control climate change, it means that once they're lit, where they were easy to suppress before, they're now very dangerous, and the conditions make it very, very hard for these fires to be suppressed, put out. And they travel very quickly, they're erratic, and they cause other fires. So if you look down the left on the slide, the human activity varies greatly. It's malicious, purposeful lighting, reckless fires, particularly campfires are a problem in the last few years, power lines causing fires, escaped burns of some sort, and changing the structure of forests is creating ignition of fires. On the right, there's conditions created by climate change that actually make these worse. And of course, it's the weather, lightning strikes. And interestingly enough, lightning strikes now are very much associated with a failure to respond to climate change. And there's about a 12% standard deviation, about 5 plus or minus 5 increase in lightning strikes with every degree centigrade of air temperature rise. And the other problem we're getting with these catastrophic fires is they're so large that they're actually creating fires themselves, ember blow, wind blowing and starting new fires around them. So it's very hard to judge how this fire actually happened. The bottom line to all this is so little is known about bushfires, which is an extraordinary position when we've gone through the trauma that we have recently. Official statistics vary wildly, both in Australia, between agencies and internationally. Most fires aren't actually investigated. Lack of reporting of many fires, for instance, if they manage to put a fire out quickly, it's often not reported. And there's a lack of research generally. How many fires, cost of fires, characteristics and behaviour of those who light fires. So unless we understand the characteristics of these people, how do we best approach prevention of fires? So people who light fires are purposefully might have an expressive reason, so that's unresolved trauma or psychopathology, or it might be instrumental. They might have undertaken a robbery and wanted to cover up evidence. So it might be an insurance issue too, or it might be just a cry for help. Arsonists are commonly children and youth, usually male, but not always. Most fires are lit in the urban-rural interface. That's where the urban structure penetrates into the bush or grassland areas. Child abuse and neglect is very much connected with people who light fires, and so is disadvantage and social exclusion. And part of the problem is the link of this with the poorly planned neighbourhoods on the city fringe, unemployment of youth, poor public transport, few services, little entertainment. And also, I've just put this down here, very few arsonists, one of the problems with all this, are actually convicted. And it's the Australian Institute of Criminology calculated that was less than 1% of arsonists are actually convicted. It might have gone up a little bit since then, but it's probably still sitting around less than 2%. So this is just a distribution of those who commit arson. You can see the peak with the youth and the children. And this is a slide that just shows where arson occurs. These are the recorded arson events, of course. So it is spread, but if you look closely, it's actually on the edge of settlements. Most people who commit arson tend to do it just very close to where they live. That's a common pattern. So what have we got? We've got linking urban planning with a vulnerability on the edges of cities and towns. And it really is a poisonous mix when you look at, say, the outer suburbs of Melbourne, to take an example. Youth disadvantage is on the urban fringe, very high unemployment. Some suburbs on the edge of Melbourne have 30% of youth underemployed or unemployed, which is really a scandal in my view. Poor urban planning that encourages the sprawl out into the bush areas and fire vulnerable areas. Lack of services and infrastructure when it's out there. They put people there before they put the things that people need out there. For instance, transport. A bus route is not allowed to go out there till the houses are all constructed. But by that time, people have bought their cars or their second cars. So the bus becomes irrelevant. Lack of infrastructure. Families moving into these areas, and when you move into a totally new area, you're out with without your past social support. So you're out with your social capital that you had before. Urban design and hotspots are being neglected. So we know where fires are often lit, but we could do an awful lot in planning to actually make these hotspots less vulnerable to fire. And the other thing, this is just a quick illustration. I'm just watching my time as I'm going there. we tend to ignore fire overlays often too in urban planning. And this is just an example. It's where I'm talking from and live down the Mornington Peninsula. And they've just built this great new gondola up Arthur's Seat. But there was very little assessment of fire risk when they built this. How on earth do you get people out of that thing hanging from a wire when it takes 8 minutes to get from the bottom of the mountain up to the top? It can take that fire, and it takes 30 minutes for the fire planes or helicopters to get to the area if they're based in Melbourne. It's just crazy. And if you look down the bottom, the rating of fire in this area is almost certain. The fire will be catastrophic and the risk is extreme. But this is what we're doing in urban planning often at the moment. And not to forget that very, very little consideration is taken of the environment when we're actually doing these developments. And the national recommendations have come out yesterday, I think, and we'll all be looking at them very closely, but none of us are very hopeful that they'll do much to protect the environment. The Conversation had a very good piece, and probably many of you have seen it recently, and says that no other disaster in living memory has caused such profound damage to Australia's biodiversity as these recent fires. And there's a list of fires, species that need urgent attention. And this is the two pictures, swift parrot and peregrine falcon, are actually living where the gondola has been put. So what happens to them when there's an extreme fire, catastrophic fire? So in summary, barriers to the prevention of bushfires. We've got an integrated approach we need. We've got systemic failures to look at this. We've got inaction on climate change and inaction on arson. And I'll just go through this, the headings, because I think I'm running out of time. Ways forward, obviously, reduce carbon emissions, really urgent if we're going to stop these increasing numbers of catastrophic fire. We need a systemic approach. We need all the people involved, not only the fire services, but child welfare, insurance companies, government departments, transport, all to coordinate. We need more bottom-up decision making. We need more prevention approaches that broaden from only doing environmental modification and prescribed burning. And finally, it's not all bad. Much less loss of human life in the fires, considerable interest in Indigenous fire practices. And I just wanted to mention GAP, Gippsland Arson Prevention Program, a really good program that's in Latrobe Valley that gets together all the people who might be involved, and the businesses and the generators and the local government, to actually understand what they can do to prevent arson. There appears to be greater interest in improving fire suppression, and there are conversations now about the impact of fire on the environment and the fact that we're losing species in Australia more than anywhere else in the world. But will this turn into action? I don't know. Okay, thank you.
We'll go straight to Alan now. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Janet. A really interesting talk to follow on from, and also thank you to Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute for giving us the opportunity to work on this. So I think I now have control of the screen. I wanted to, knowing what Janet was going to present, wanted to present a slightly different view that I hope is complementary insofar that I want to reveal some of the thinking behind current approaches, but to do it in such a way that perhaps reveals some of the, and openly acknowledges, I hope, some of the challenges to integration, and perhaps some of the assumptions that we have that have brought about the sort of circumstances that Janet has so nicely described in this problem of prevention. the first slide I've got here, and I'm going to speak to a few images to sort of provoke some of these discussions. The first slide I've got here is one way, and I hasten to say it's just one way, of thinking about risk management. And this can be applied to all kinds of things, but in this instance to bushfire risk reduction. And the core idea here is that we're seeking to reduce risk as much as we can. Perhaps we can't get rid of it altogether, but to do that, we would reduce the amount of exposure, so don't have people and things we care about near fires, reduce the vulnerability, so have people near fires. If people are near fires, hopefully they're not the more vulnerable parts of our community, or if there are structures or assets, they can withstand fire. But also to understand that we have hazards, in this case, the fire itself, and indeed the ignition of that hazard, as Janet has so nicely presented, creates that hazard of the bushfire. So this is a view where we see the risk being generated by the interaction of those three sides of the triangle. And on the right-hand side of that slide, you can see in a conceptual way that yes, we might be able to modify that risk by dealing with the hazard and the fuel, the vegetation, reducing vulnerability in a range of ways, and dealing with exposure, hopefully something that urban planning can do very well by having fewer people building and living and working and recreating in risky areas. And I think this is a useful way of thinking. However, it can have some negative impacts in that it tends to take us to physical responses. And I think this is one of the things urban planning tends towards, or land use planning, depending what tradition or what state or what country you're in, city planning, town planning, urban planning, tends towards physical first and foremost before the social, before the environmental, despite all the things we say. And this is a challenge. So I'm just trying to get, I think I've lost control of the screen there. So maybe Basil or Claire might help me by moving to the next slide. Yeah, I'll need it. Thank you. So without going through each one of these diagrams, this is a recent paper we published, and trying to categorise and summarise the main ways that we would deal with bushfire risk. And as I was preparing for this talk, I thought I'll have another look at this paper, and it very quickly brought home to me that we do tend to have this tendency towards using the land use planning system in a very physical way, even though we know there are many social and economic and environmental aspects to what we do. That's not to say the physical is not important. It's clearly very, very central to these problems. Where we put things and who is there and how things are connected up are core. But I do believe one of the key problems we face is just acknowledging the range of other impacts and other things that are going on within a physical arrangement of structures or buildings or roads or interactions with the natural world. So the next slide, please. So I don't intend to go through this clearly very complex diagram, but rather to use it to illustrate that when we are moving through an urban planning process, and of course these processes are dynamic and ongoing, what we end up with in the top of the screen, you can see there, a risk triangle, as I started off with, and within that we can imagine, okay, in a given place there's a level of risk, but how do we get there? And the real challenge with urban planning, of course, and the way we manage places, and that's the natural world as well as humans with responsibilities, is so complex. So our work has sought to open up some of that complexity and to acknowledge some of the decisions. And what became very clear was that many of the decisions are a long way upstream, like decisions that are made in advance, and that bring about unknowingly many of the risks that are faced in a place. So in some ways, the prevention is of considered and knowledgeable understandings of bushfire risk in places, the structures, the physical outcomes, but also the social aspects as well. Next slide, please. So I obviously, you know, like Janet, there's a lot I could say, but I want to just move through a few images now to just illustrate what I see as some key points that would illustrate this challenge. One of the problems we often have is how we deal with the edge of settlements, in this case, Greater Bendigo. And one of the big challenges that we have is anticipating and then making decisions on future risk. We are making improvements over time in terms of this, but I still see that many decisions are made when there's not really an assessment of what the future risk will be in a place in terms of bushfire. In fact, in many ways, across a range of hazards beyond bushfire itself. So we're not testing the scenario in advance of how risky something will be, or we do it at the last minute when something is seen as a fait accompli. Next slide, please. One way of dealing with that is directly going towards scenario testing, and I know this is a complex pair of slides, but essentially it's some work we've been doing, looking at how risky something is with and without certain treatments, and just trying to anticipate how settlements might grow and the impacts of different planning controls or different land management practices with and without improved treatments. And you know, just trying to anticipate that is of course very complex, but it will be better if we avoid those risky places developing in ways that are unsuitable. Next slide, please. And of course, we have the problem of existing settlements. It's not just the structures themselves, as I said, but also who lives in them. So I chose a slide here from Wye River, what is known sometimes as the Christmas Day 2015 fire, and a great illustration, I believe, of some of the complexities of thinking about bushfire risk, because all of our regulations, of course, are oriented towards the future, regulating new structures or if things are modified to a high degree. But actually, many of our real risks are in existing settlements where things were built prior to standards being established. That includes the buildings themselves, but also the road networks, the management of vegetation, whether or not the settlement should have been there in the first place, but also the other element that's really ignored a lot of the time, and Janet spoke about key elements of this: who's going to live there, and will they be there, and will they be capable or making good decisions? In the case of Wye River, one of the challenges, of course, is people who own these properties but are usually absent. That's not an indictment on them, it's just their holiday homes, but also tourism populations will not have the same level of resilience because they may not even speak the language, for example, or be unfamiliar. So we have a range of challenges with existing settlements. The current presumption of urban planning is very much towards the future and new structures, and we need ways of thinking about and working on what's happening in our existing settlements, particularly since the risks, as Janet so nicely illustrated, are really ramping up because of climate change and the way we manage land. Next slide, please. So again, another complicated diagram, and thank you, Leonardo, for producing this recently in some recent work. We've been mapping change over time on the edge of Melbourne. And one thing that's become very clear is that risk assessment is usually not undertaken in land release processes until we get to the PNR, the point of no return. And what this means is that often we're trying to play catch up with bushfire risk, or indeed other types of risk in our settlements, after the pressure is on to build in a place. And it reveals an assumption towards that we could always come up with treatments to deal with bushfire risk by designing better and having better response and all these sorts of things. But actually, maybe we need to have worked out what the risk would be in the future and decided that maybe some places shouldn't be built on at all. Now, we do this a little bit, but so many of the places we've assessed have really revealed that we often get past this point of no return until it's too late to really do something meaningful about it. Next slide, please. Good, yeah, thank you. And alongside that challenge with the point of no return is something I'm just trying to illustrate a little bit with these diagrams on the right here, where even though disaster risk reduction nowadays is an area of work where there's a real understanding that we need to cross between disciplinary groups, what we still need to catch up with a lot of our legislation, our processes, and the actual ways we get decisions made. So even though there's a much greater appetite for joining up decision-making processes, when we really drill down to those disciplinary groups working together, there aren't that many touch points where decisions are made, particularly at the front end, the really high-level strategic end of the process of land release. So this, to me, is an area where we could make significant gains in terms of improving our risk profiles for bushfire. But it perhaps needs legislative change. Human behaviour, I wanted just to add to some things that Janet said. This is a shot in Wye River again, just after the 2015 fire came through, and you can see the first rains came through and grass started growing, and I was able to move around the settlement just looking at the existing buildings. And after the fire, so heaps of structures were, burnt down or were in the process of being cleared up, etc. at this time. And the thing that really struck me is that even after an incredibly significant fire in this settlement, how many of these buildings were still not being maintained in a way that would make them safe or safer in terms of bushfire. And it really reveals that us humans really don't take things into account when we ought to, I suppose. And it's not just the maintenance of buildings, of course, it's our behaviours, it's our acceptance of risk without really knowing what risk means. It could be that we don't even know that we're in a bushfire-prone area. We don't know the actual nature, the qualities of the structure we're occupying, whether it's been built to withstand fire or whether it has not. What the wind direction is that is dangerous or safe, etc. So there's so many aspects of this that we need to keep working on, as well as all the physical things that the planning system tends to deal with. Next slide, please. And part of this, of course, is just people. I did a recent field trip in Western Australia prior to the lockdown, looking at some of the bushfire risks there. And one of the things that really concerns me is that people buy land, occupy land over time, and there aren't really any meaningful triggers about the nature of risks on that land until that moment when someone wants to build. And I think that is just one moment in the life cycle of land. And it has many other implications. Excessive clearing, when perhaps it didn't need to be cleared or even built on anyway. When people buy a structure on land, they don't find out all of the details of what the bushfire risks are, or how the structure was built, or how you're meant to occupy it in fire weather conditions and so forth. So there's many areas of lack in human knowledge and the way we treat that need to be next to the more formal regulated mechanisms of urban planning and building control and so forth. Next slide, please. And the other aspect, and I thought of this just thinking in preparation for this talk, as Janet mentioned, we've got a Royal Commission that's going to release its findings in, I think it's August. But some work we did looking into previous Royal Commissions and inquiries revealed that we keep coming up with the same findings again and again. We don't really use those findings to really trigger fundamental change to the ways that we build and occupy and use land, but rather we use those inquiries to sort of reinforce many of the problems we already have, and we don't really use them as a big phase shift mechanism of really embracing this significant problem in new ways. And I really hope that the vastness of that recent event we had end of last year into the beginning of this year might just get us to really make a fundamental change here, because there's so much at risk. Next slide, please, or is that my last slide? Last one, and human vulnerability, of course. I wanted to sort of acknowledge that we as humans have certain capabilities and vulnerabilities. This is the Candlebark School in Romsey near Macedon. I chose this one because it illustrates just the nature of vulnerability being so different between different populations and different types of groups in our wider population, and the need for us to take this into account. It's not one size fits all. Candlebark School I chose because it was the subject of Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal decisions and trying to really work through what it means to have vulnerable people in a risky location. And I think we are making some small inroads into this, but we really need to think, to reinforce Janet's point, about the whole range of characteristics of people well beyond the physical structures, and to not just think of vulnerability, in fact, but to think of capability and knowledge development and sharing, and really living with the land in meaningful ways, rather than just sort of using a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach that seeks to sort of engineer the risk out of it, because it's impossible. We've seen that now. So I think that's my last slide. So I'll leave it there. There's another slide, I beg your pardon. The last point was that we tend in our urban planning system, and I guess as an urban planner, it's my job to sort of self-critique what we do. I think we do very well on this law, policy and regulation stuff. In fact, I think we overdo it, but actually we tend not to be particularly good at modifying existing places, about our strategic planning, about really developing vision at a wide scale and for individual places. So we probably don't need a lot more regulation. We need all the other types of planning, community-based planning, working with the land, working with the environment. So I hope we can work on that. And there's plenty of good things we can do. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. We'll go to Roz Hansen now.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And I'll be very brief because I really do want people to have an opportunity to ask questions. I found the book really interesting to read. From a planner's perspective, I know nothing about the people who light fires. So Janet's work in that space has been quite revealing to me, and I think it raises this whole issue again of where are people living and what are their vulnerabilities. And it is quite clear that in the urban fringe areas of our capital cities, our regional cities, we are starting to see people really not feeling part of the community. The youth unemployment rate and the low level of VCE completion in these communities is very concerning. And I think also too, a lot of these communities don't have the social capital, as Janet has indicated, that I think is a fundamental problem of social exclusion or lack of social cohesion. And so therefore, when you're profiling people who are more likely to fight light fires, the youth issue I think is absolutely paramount, because they are the ones that are being left behind in these more remote and fringe communities. And I'd say that also in terms of housing affordability, we're starting to see people not only choosing to live in these locations because they have so little choice to live closer to work or education or services, but we're seeing people now being pushed into the small towns. Many of those small towns are in rural landscapes, be they grasslands or forest landscapes, and again, they are being faced in a position of living in areas of vulnerability to bushfire. I think the planning system is very much biased towards the instruments, the bushfire overlays and other planning instruments in our toolkit, but we're not really looking at the future proofing. And I rather liked Alan's approach to scenario development. I think we need to think about, well, what is the risk of putting settlements or putting certain types of developments into these landscapes, into these environments, and what can we do to reduce the risk? And in some cases, that will mean that we'll have to say no. We simply cannot have development in those locations because the risks are so high. So I think that's very important, this scenario development. Can I say also, I think that generally speaking, much of the emphasis in the planning space has also been on the physical. I agree with what Alan's saying there. And I thought his images were quite provocative, because I can relate to some of those images where people are looking for rural lifestyles, are looking for small community lifestyles, but in the same token, they're being faced with issues of being placed in areas of high vulnerability. And then that puts a lot of pressure on emergency services to actually access those areas. And I think that then rolls out a whole lot of planning related, social, physical related issues that become very difficult for the emergency services to have to respond to. I guess that one of my concerns in this whole conversation is road access and the ability for people in these situations to actually escape when there is a bushfire approaching. And I've been quite critical about the rebuilding and recovery efforts in the past, where we're placing people back into these locations where the one road is in is the same road out, and I refer to Malakuta is an example of that. Certainly Wye River is an example of that, and even to some degree the Marysville fires in 2009, where we've really put people in a situation where there isn't a viable escape route, and then they're living in a physical situation which has steep slopes, it has valleys and gullies, it has forested landscapes, wind direction. All of these factors just enhance their vulnerability in terms of being faced with, life or death, which is very significant. I guess another issue I'd like to raise, not necessarily in the book, is how do we retrofit the existing developments that are already in these high bushfire prone areas? Do we need to start looking at bunkers, be they individual or community-based bunkers, as a place of retreat? What about the buyback schemes? For instance, I know in Tathra here, I'm currently in New South Wales, the shop behind me is the 5th of January 2020, when we were surrounded by bushfires in Merimbula. But how do we deal with the buyback schemes where we simply shouldn't be encouraging communities to go back and rebuild because we're just putting them in the same situation, and in fact, the more frequent situation of perhaps being faced with bushfires? I'll say no more. I'm interested in the question, Sangeeta.
Thanks very much, Roz, for your response, and thanks to Alan and Janet for really provocative presentations. Janet and Alan, I might just give you a few moments to see if you have any comments on Roz's response, and then we'll start taking questions. I've only got a couple of questions in the Q&A, so please feel free to type them in the next few minutes.
Well, perhaps Janet should begin.
Thank you, Roz, and thank you, Alan. They were both really interesting overviews. Yes, the whole issue of buyback, which wasn't gone into very much in the book, I think it actually is at huge cost, because we're just spreading people right through vulnerable areas. I mean, it's a massive problem, and Australia is actually, I believe, and Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're quite well advanced internationally with new housing, how they should be built to protect them from fire. But it's a massive problem with retrofitting. What do we do with all of, and who should pay? And it's going to reach a crunch point, if you like, because the insurance companies are just going to bob out eventually. I mean, they won't be able to cope with the damage, and who's going to pay to make these places safe if people want to live there? What do we do about it? It's a real moral question.
Yeah, I mean, I for my part, to follow that, I don't think there are easy answers, but I do know that significant gains can usually be made even on very old structures near vegetation with relatively simple modifications. But unfortunately, that doesn't really fit in to our current regulatory system. So it sort of falls between the boundaries, and it's possible that we need to explore that in a bit more detail. As soon as you start putting a regulatory burden on people, they're going to avoid it. But on the other hand, if people take sort of responsibility and considered understanding of what risks they face, perhaps generational change will start to bring careful and incremental improvement. Because I think what we really need to be doing is thinking about how to live with fire in a wider set of ways, in ways that fit with the environment, that don't mean wholesale slash and burn of vegetation, that mean maintaining habitat and all those things. So I think, and they're very place specific. It depends on the landscape that we're in. It's not just forests, it's sometimes grasslands, there's heritage concerns, and so forth. So it's really a matter of building up that knowledge set in places over time.
Thanks for those responses. And now we might go to some of the questions. If I can paraphrase, I think there are some questions here about community engagement and community-based planning, and what are some of the strategies that exist for effective community planning around this, and what are some of the barriers that are being faced?
Alan, that might be one for you, is it?
Oh, okay. Yes, boss. Well, I dare say we would each have something to comment there. But one of the big challenges is that there's generational change. People who see one fire out and really become experienced in it may not be the people who see the next fire. We have, a range of different types of populations. So when we do engage in community, with communities and work with communities, the first challenge is, of course, often it's not the whole of the community that we're working with, but often those people are not there in 10 or 20 years when the fire comes. So there's a real slippage or a dissonance temporally, time-wise, between who designs the structure and where it goes on the land, who maintains the garden, what happens on the land next door, and generational change or tourism populations and so forth. So the the community is such a changeable thing to work with. And well, and then there's reconstruction, but maybe Janet or Roz would like to add to that. Yeah.
Roz, do you want to?
Yes, look, I think this issue of community engagement is really important, because I do believe that a lot of the reaction and recovery initiatives have been a top-down approach, and the community's been left wondering, well, what's our role? And I often say, we say to communities, oh, you've got to be more resilient. No, communities need to be more resourceful. And they are a really excellent resource, and they really are a supportive resource in terms of helping people who are suffering from the trauma of loss of life or loss of property, or both. So I'm a great believer in community. I'm a great believer in starting at the local level. I'm a great believer in engaging with the community in formulating and implementing policies and programs, and ensuring that they're funded and they're assisted in every capacity that government can offer them. For me, the grassroots, everything starts at the local level. And if you can't give the confidence and the certainty to communities that they can participate and be in control of their own destiny, then you're really misusing that resource.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Vulnerability has been a critical theme, and Janet, you in particular have brought this out. How do we engage vulnerable members of the community in this bottom-up planning process?
Yes. I again endorse what Alan and Roz has said. With the whole problem, because of the increasing and the severity of bushfires, the fire services can't do the lot. It's just physically impossible, and the cost will be so great. So it's absolutely vital we engage the community, and local people know who is vulnerable, who's going to be at risk, who they've got to go and knock on the door and remind them that you have to do this, this and this, or go around and see if they're okay, and have got their fire resources in place, or their escape plan, or whatever. It's a local community, and it's a local community that knows what areas are vulnerable in an environmental sense too. What is their priority to save the area? What is most important to them? Where's their sense of belonging most centred in the community? So resources and power need to be shared with the community to assist a whole lot of government and other agencies to actually manage these fires. And if we can help use the resources of the community to reduce the fires, then the cost of suppression and all these other sides to the stories of bushfire will be much lower.
I just wanted to add something to that. So Sangeetha, for sort of jumping in. The other sort of element here I don't think gets talked about enough is the role of local government. We have state-based emergency organisations. We have local fire brigades and emergency services, but local government has a huge role to play. But they don't really have great resources to work on this. Local government is required via legislation to have emergency plans, but they are pretty much universally unable to really act on them prior to events to reduce risks in any meaningful way. So there's this missing component between, and this is not really a negative comment on local government, it's just resources, I think, and legislative capability. Communities can be great. We've got, our emergency services are pretty amazing, I think, having looked around the world. But, how does local government knit that together is a whole area that I believe is really badly under-resourced.
Thanks. I'll just go to another theme that's coming through, and this is around forests and forest management. A question from Mary Lush: if we are to tackle climate change, we need to maximise carbon storage in forests. Do we need to consciously consider protecting the forest from the people as well as the people from the forest? Another question has asked, do we actually need the timber industry so that access roads can be maintained? So this is obviously a complex issue. Do you have any comments on the link with with forestry?
Yes, I can make a couple of comments. We certainly need to do forests a lot better in many ways, and this is, I would very much argue, move away from a predominance of prescribed burning in forests, because it actually changes the forests and in some cases increases fire risk. It's to do things like manage access on a total fire ban day. All the roads we put for logging or whatever through forests are actually access points for people to go in and privately light fires if that's what they want to do. Forests actually create moisture, cool temperatures. They're our vital part of human life, and the way we're destroying the environment and forests is disastrous, really, and it has huge implications. If we recall the terrible fires that we've just been through, well, that's just over 1 degree centigrade of temperature rise. We're actually aiming up to close to 4 degrees. That's where we're heading at the moment because of the lack of policy around climate change. The first and vital thing is to actually, let's get some policy to reduce carbon emissions.
Alan or Roz, did you want to comment on forest management?
No, I think that speaks very nicely to it, Janet. And I think, well, I would say one thing. I really believe we need to design our settlements to accept all of the processes of the forest, or actually the vegetation. It's not just forests, as I said before. If you know, somewhat regular fires are part of that as a natural process, and that's another debate, then our settlements should be designed and sited to deal with that as if it were normal. So without trying to introduce unwanted complexity there, it's our role as humans to accept the natural world as a starting point for all of this, rather than seeing the forest as the enemy, or, you know, some unusual approach like that.
Thanks very much. We're close to running out of time. I'm conscious that there are quite a few questions that have come up. Some are quite specific. What I might suggest in the interest of time is that if you want to continue the conversation, I think the speakers are happy to stay on for another 10 minutes or so. And maybe you guys can pick up some of these questions that are coming up that are of specific relevance. But for everybody else, we might close the formal part of the seminar today. And thank you very much for joining us. There's been about 110 people participating in this. And I think there's a huge amount of interest, obviously, in this issue. And it's great to raise the profile on the somewhat neglected theme of prevention of bushfires. So could you join me, please, in thanking Janet, Alan, and Roz for their presentations and responses today. And thank you all in the audience for joining us as well. I'll allow the conversation to continue now as you see fit. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You could also use the chat function, Alan and Janet, if
Yes,
if you want to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
How will we know the questions that people have got?
Can you
I don't know.
Q&A? If you click on the Q&A button.
Yes.
I see it.
Yeah.
There are a lot of questions.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
There was a question about the EPBC Act inquiry and whether they're touching on some of these issues that you've raised. That's one of the first questions. Urban fringe planning, is it getting heard in the review of the EPBC Act?
Right. That's the Environmental Act.
Yes, yeah, the interim report just came out. Yes.
I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I've got great pessimism about it, because something like 10% of all land clearing hasn't actually considered the Act. It's just gone through currently, and I don't think they see that as a problem particularly. They want to hurry through a lot of development, the federal government, to get over the COVID and the unemployment. But actually those two issues don't, in my view, don't conflict. You can find many, many good projects like social housing to do, so you don't have to actually destroy the environment to actually bring the economy back to where the federal government would like it to be.
Can I speak to a question I saw there? I'm sort of trying to, I tried to see new questions we hadn't touched on, and there's one there from Sizhe Wu. Apologies for bad pronunciation. My question is, could you talk a little bit how the landscape recovers from bushfire and how large and small scale design can help post-bushfire scenarios? I think that's a really interesting area. And Roz spoke a little bit about this, that I think we tend to expect rebuilding to look pretty much like what was there before, except with a slightly better house, to sort of maybe grossly sort of summarise what happens. I think that the opportunity for redesign and reimagining communities at the house scale, at the street scale, at the settlement scale is not particularly well dealt with. Realigning roads is always really challenging. Anyone who's worked on road resumptions and things like that will tell you that. However, it really does offer the opportunity to reshape lots, to have greater separation, to have greater numbers of access routes, and to join up the design changes on individual lots into a wider bushfire resilient community. And that terminology is one that I sort of use a little bit cautiously because there's so much potentially there. And to think of modification to not just the structures and the roads, but also to the vegetation in very sensitive ways, so that the approach of fires is brought under control through careful planting, not just widespread raising of trees, because actually usually it's not the trees that are the problem, it's the under and middle stories. And that approach, if that can be moderated, and in a recovery situation we have that opportunity to really fit it all together and see a whole of community approach. So I like that question because I think it's a very positive way to think about rebuilding, that we now get to go back to some of the fundamentals. And I don't think we've got enough of the toolkit at our disposal in those situations. We need to open that out a little bit more.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with Alan. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it is a great challenge to retrofit or re-engineer these settlements that are in high bushfire prone areas. And the community can work that out, you know. The community can sit down and actually answer these questions and have a pathway forward in terms of how they're going to be better equipped and better planned in terms of any potential bushfire event. So I think there's, you know, an untapped resource there based on people actually sitting down and dealing with those very critical issues. And also in this context, talking about, you know, how do they retreat? Where do they go? Where is their safest point of refuge? And again, I come back to this idea of possibly looking at bunkers, which should be subsidised by government. You should be encouraged to actually, in times where you can't get out for whatever reason, because the fire literally surrounds you, at least you have a point of refuge and retreat. And the community can do it. They can work it out. And I think this is all part of engaging and making the community take responsibility for their livelihood.
Perhaps I might address another question from Ray Ison. Where in our current governance systems are there leverage points for reform? In a climate emergency, will this be too little too late? So I think actually Ray goes to the nub of the problem there. even these inquiries that are state-based and the Royal Commission are not looking at, they're looking at governance more broadly, but they're looking at it very narrowly. And it's got to go beyond the structure of a good governance within the fire services to a much broader governance to include so many members of the community, business, other government, Department of Planning, Department of Transport, to actually get the systems going so that we can address this. And in a climate emergency, will this be too little too late? It already is in many ways too late. We've already gone through these catastrophic fires and we're going to go through more, but you know, let's start right now and do this. But I don't think we're even talking about doing this systemic type of approach to prevention of bushfire and general management of bushfire.
I saw a question I think is interesting, and I don't have the complete answer, but some ideas on it from John Bates. And John writes, with the quantum of built risk exposure to natural hazards already in place across the continent, are there any approaches that will ever allow us to catch up and actively reduce our collective risk exposure? It's a daunting prospect to think of in that way, but I think it's quite realistic. So it's daunting for a good reason. There are ideas floating around, and some of them are more workable than others, but I don't think we're really capturing them very well. One, for example, would be to impose point of sale regulations and requirements on property. It would be grossly unpopular. It would be, but if someone were to buy a property in a very risky bushfire location, they're allowed to just buy it if they're not modifying the structure. Now, that concerns me because they are taking on a risk, whether they know it or not, but it just sort of means that rolls into the future. Now, our property system, caveat emptor, buyer beware, exists. Maybe it's time to modify that fundamental principle. And there is a little modifier to this. Of course, for example, in Victoria, the section 32, am I getting the state right? Declaration, you find out it's in a bushfire management overlay, but that's all. You don't know whether that structure has been designed well, if at all. You don't know if it's in the same condition as when it was built, if someone's planted more there, or any of those things. So I really think that point of sale information and perhaps a requirement to bring structures and property up to a standard at point of sale could be a game changer, although I recognise it would be profoundly unpopular because it would disrupt people's inheritances and all kinds of things. But maybe some areas are so risky, there is a need for that to occur because we have a duty of care to not let that move into future generations.
Will I go with another question?
Sure.
Rod Keenan asks, what is the role of improved forest management and fuel reduction as a way of reducing hazard, both in and around houses and infrastructure, and more broadly in the landscape to allow rapid suppression when fires start under extreme conditions? Certainly there is a role for clearing and prescribed burning, but the research seems to be suggesting, and we need a hell of a lot more research on this, but it seems to be suggesting that it's most effective immediately around the house and in the close proximity. A lot of prescribed burning is done way in the forests where people aren't living, and in fact, in some cases, fire is actually needed for these forests, and in some cases, both here and internationally, the fires are allowed to burn as a means of an ecological type of approach to the forests. But what we need to do is understand a lot more nuanced information around forests. There's very rarely an environmental review done before prescribed burning takes place, and we need to move more to a cultural burning approach from the Indigenous community, the Indigenous Australians, and there is a lot more interest and a lot more talk about that, where it's more a mosaic approach to burning rather than a great big fire that just burns from the ground up to the top of the trees. And small patches, and often done during the wet season, so it can't actually get big and take over. But a lot of forests too, where especially down in Tasmania as an example, there's never been fire in some of those really old down in the national park in southwestern Tasmania. Fire isn't part of that environment. So we need to be a lot more nuanced and careful in how we understand and take this approach with forests and fire.
Can I just chip in on that one? Because Rod does raise a complex question, but I think it speaks to the core of what we do in many ways. I did do some research with CSIRO after the 2009 fires, looking at the approach of the fire to northwestern Bendigo, the Maiden Gully fire. And it's really hard to sort of draw causality because we only get to look at a case. But that and a few other fires I've looked at, the intensity of the fire's approach is significantly lower when, just as Janet says, there's fuel reduction near to the settlement. And it's a way better bang for buck, but it means the people who live in that area, you know, perhaps have to suffer smoke on their washing line or viticulture, or it's not that there's viticulture there, but, you know, whatever's going on, they're going to suffer from smoke, you know, being around their settlement, possibly at an uncomfortable time. But to add to that, there's a need for a whole of system, if you like, approach. You can't just reduce the fuel. You need to have the fencing designed properly. You need to have gardens managed properly. You need to have structures managed properly. You need to have the fire services able to get access. So we really need joined up approaches as well. But I think Rod's question is a good one because we haven't really linked that in a scale-based way very, very effectively.
Thanks. Can I take the liberty and ask a question about market signals and in particular insurance, because there was some optimism around those signals driving behaviour change. Do we have much evidence that the insurance industry is out front in registering risk through those kinds of premium increases, and is that having an impact in consumer decision making? This is particularly for existing settlements.
Does anyone else want to have a go with that, or? Well,
yeah, I don't think I can give a clear answer on that one.
As far as I know, the premiums go up after a natural hazard event. For instance, in the flooding that we had a few years ago in Queensland, the premium went up. And it'll get to the point where people won't be able to afford the insurance, and they'll drop out. And that's what happened. I particularly studied the flood in Queensland a few years ago, and that's what happened. A lot of people dropped off out and didn't get insurance. A lot of the big insurance companies, of course, have got their own reinsurers, so they've got a lot of finance propping them up. But as the hazards increase because of our failure in climate change over time, our general hazards, these insurance claims will go up and up, and I don't know whether we have an answer of what's going to happen and what the outcome is. And the other side to that is because people who are perhaps don't have as much income or are vulnerable in a few ways, tend to buy land and houses or rent houses or live in areas where there are hazards, simply because the price of the property is reflected in the danger of living there. So it tends to be disadvantaged people who live in fire-prone places in one sense, but not when people go for a lifestyle to live in the bush, but particularly around low-lying land if you're looking at floods and things. So they're the very people who can't afford the insurance who are more vulnerable. So we have a big problem, and I don't believe it's been addressed properly.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a really good question, because bear in mind that in a lot of the small settlements, there are a lot of people who are renting. They are there because the rents are obviously lower than in a more urbanised environment. And when the fire comes through, they lose everything, contents, everything. They leave that property with just the clothes on their back, and that's it. And they have very little opportunity economically to recover from that situation. So I would have thought it was smart of insurance companies, if they want to keep their balance books looking healthy, to look at ways of actually incentivising the insurance system for those people who are prepared to retrofit and undertake certain changes to their residences that make them more fireproof, and also make sure that in the context of land management immediately around them, that they again take some responsibility. So in other words, incentivise the system so that people can see that there is a benefit in them being more responsible in dealing with fireproofing their property, rather than just leaving it for an event that eventually becomes catastrophic.
There's a problem with rent. Sorry,
is there evidence of that incentivising occurring amongst insurers?
I'm not aware of it, but to me it's a sort of a no-brainer. And let's face it, insurance companies are in business, all right? So they want to be able to obviously expand their business. And let's say that they might incentivise from the point of view of if people are prepared to do that, to actually reduce premiums, or at least offer more affordable insurance. But at this stage, what we're looking at, the coastline of New South Wales at the moment, where the high seas are just, there are million-dollar properties hanging on the edges of cliffs. So it's not just affecting those that can't afford to live in these situations, but it's affecting those that have got a reasonable amount of income. So the insurance companies really have to have a wake-up call and look at ways that they can actually improve their business, and incentives, to me, is one way of doing it with these sorts of problems.
Thanks. I have to go, but I'll let you guys continue the conversation.
I think I might need to go as well. I'm already late.
well, maybe I can look at some of the questions and respond over the next week or so to people if there's lots of unanswered questions.
There's actually some great questions. I just saw Peter Christoph asked about consultation, and a fantastic comment, I think. And I just feel I must answer that or make a comment on it without reading out Peter's comment. It's quite long. I agree that our current consultation process is just the bare bones. It's not really designed to engage carefully with communities. In fact, the statutory system is like a bare minimum style of consultation. So the problem we have is that good consultation is usually all of the other things that occur outside our statutory processes. And it really comes down to a a careful and very considered and appropriate consultation with a given community. So, you know, the regulatory approaches to consultation are, well, frankly, are quite divisive and combative, and you only get these little moments where you might be able to have input to the process. So, I agree with you, Peter, that we don't really have consultation in a regulatory way that works, but perhaps that all needs to change. And perhaps we don't need a regulated approach, but maybe best practice approaches that are sort of designed to fit for the different circumstances we have. Recovery is one, but also modifying a community in advance, a high-risk community, for example, large scale versus small scale. So, you know, I know Roz has been involved in all kinds of consultations over the years, but the regulation is the least part of it.
Yeah.
It's everything else. But I must go, so.
Yeah, can I just comment on this, because this is a real problem for planners, is, you know, dealing with the whole issue of community engagement and consultation, and there are lots of different methodologies. You know, the fundamental question here is ask the community how they want to be consulted. Ask them, and different communities will have different responses because they'll differ from a demographic point of view, they'll differ from a cultural point of view, an ethnicity issue here in terms of how you consult with different cultures. Ask the community how they want to be consulted, and ask not just the squeaky wheels, the noisy people in the community. Ask the people who don't normally put their hand up how they want to participate and how they want to engage. And that's a really simple, good starting point. Often we answer the question for them. I think it's time that we actually ask the community, what do you want to get out of this engagement? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Roz, very much. If I'm going to answer some of these questions, I'll need an email address, so if people can send their questions with their contacts, so I can respond at a later date.
Janet?
Yes.
Janet, I have an idea. We've actually captured all the questions that have come through.
Yeah.
So what we can do, if you're happy to respond to those at a later date, we can circulate them to all the participants. We have.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to sign off also. So thank you, everybody, for being involved. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
And thank you, Janet. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.